This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio is brought to you by the IEEE Computer Society and by IEEE Software Magazine. Online at computer.org/software.
I'm Adam Gordon-Bell for Software Engineering Radio. Today, I have with me Berkay. Berkay's the co-founder of Ops Genie, which is, I think, now an Atlassian company, and an expert on modern incident management practices. Berkay, welcome to Software Engineering Radio.
Hey, Adam, thanks.
So I wanted to pick your brain a little bit about, what is an incident management process? And if I'm a developer and my organization is trying to introduce some sort of process, what type of things do I need to know? So I thought a good place to start would be like, what's an incident?
Yeah, the incident is anything that's unexpected that disrupts the systems or applications, whatever you're running. That's unplanned, unexpected.
Why do I need a management process for that?
This became more of a importance or a priority in the later years as the expectations of the users and the customers for availability of a service, reliability, performance, security increased, as well as the pressure in the market to innovate and do things faster and faster. Like the rate of change also changed. There might be an incident that if the organization reacts fast enough to prevent the impact on the users as well and resolve it before the customers or users are impacted by that incident as well. So it's often a race against time. And, as the developers or the people operating the service, we want to make sure that we either mitigate the impact that as little as possible, or, ideally prevent the impact from happening by responding on time, finding the problem and resolving as quickly as possible.
So that's interesting. So if we act fast enough, we might actually prevent there from being any impact. What common causes of incidents do you see?
By far, the most common cause of incidents is change. Yeah. And the rate of change increased, as I'm sure in the recent years with all the the DevOps and all the paradigms that came with it. And the rate of change is really the biggest driver of incidents in our systems.
And so that would make me think that the way to prevent incidents is to slow down change. Is that the approach?
It is a common approach, but the research kind of indicates that it isn't true. So that's actually the typical friction point in organizations. The developers would like to, because business wants things to change or new things to come out as fast as possible. Developers tries to push those things, and the operations folks are typically resisting change because the change is what introduces all the the instability problems to the system. And in the traditional enterprise, there's a major friction between dev and ops. They push in different directions. And in the last decade, the DevOps movement attempts to address that by changing all the paradigm and developers and operations folks working together, breaking that silo so that negative dynamic is not there. So there are different ways to solve that. If you make frequent changes, small changes, you minimize the sort of the rate of failure, or when there is a failure, you can address it very quickly because as you make frequent changes, each change is very small.
Yeah, if I can take the other side, because it sounds interesting.
Yeah.
To me, it sounds like that's actually making more changes, right? You're saying change causes incidents, but now, instead of releasing every week, we're going to release every day. That sounds like more change to me, more places where things can break.
Yeah, that's where it's somewhat, intuitively you go the other direction initially. But what we find ourselves as well, that when the change is small, you kind of accept that some portion of that will cause a problem, but you can address that. So typically in this, they want to look at the change failure rate, how often the change causes a problem. The metric is how long it takes you to restore it. So like you try to reduce the number of failures, but also like how long it takes you to find the time to determine and fix the problem. the unexpected maybe thing is that when you do fewer changes, the changes are like you do one change, but it has a lot of things in it because the developers keep developing, right? So like it's actually not one change. Like you just have one big change that has 100 changes in it, and if that breaks something, it's typically very difficult to find what it is. So the mean time to repair keeps getting longer and longer, and you can't prevent the customer's impact in those cases. There are a number of practices that dev teams came up with in the recent years. One of them is like feature flagging, canary stuff. Like so, you can kind of roll out, test, and with a subset of users before you roll out to everybody else. But the key is really they know exactly what they've done and how they would detect a problem, like if it didn't work. So the time to awareness of the problem and the ability to dissect what the problem is, troubleshoot is much higher because the developer knows what they've done. And because the change is smaller, the number of options that you have to check is not that high either. So they can quickly revert the change or fix it or whatever. So it's interesting that the body of research indicates that these type of frequent change makes the system more stable and not less, which is a interesting concept.
Yeah, definitely. Can you define feature flagging and canary builds and then maybe explain how they'd help?
Sure. Let's say you have 100,000 users that use your system and you make a change and you expose all of them. If there is a failure, it's going to impact everybody. Like, so you have a significant problem versus the canary one, you can put a cohort of 1,000 people and enable the feature for them first. If there is a problem, you still had a problem, but only 1% of your users got impacted by that. So that's, I think in the core of it, the fact that you just accept that there will be a problem and no amount of testing in advance in the lab and so on will tell you, like, will make it sure that in production when you deploy, it's going to work. So you're deploying in production, but containing it to the blast radius to a small radius so that if there's a problem, you roll it back, but the impact is much smaller than what it would be. And the feature flagging is sort of a similar concept that you sort of separate the deployment of the features from enablement of the feature. Like you deploy the feature and then slowly turn it on for people using the feature flag or customers. Like in SaaS, we have customers as tenants, so you can enable for one tenant, 5 tenants, and if it goes okay, but you look at metrics and you enable for more people. So it's a more controlled approach to handle that, the inevitable, like there will be something wrong. I think the approach to assume that there won't be incidents and try to prevent incidents proven to be like you'll lose that battle. So it's better to be prepared for it, like that this will happen, and if it does happen, what do you do? Like, so one part is to have a process, an incident management process that's ready, so you don't have to think of anything. Like exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah,
you get to the right person as quickly as possible. Like escalate. How long you're going to wait to escalate. Which person do you go depending on time of day. If you have 24/7 services in different continents, you can leverage the business hours and wherever. Like all that. Who are you going to tell otherwise? The stakeholders, the business users, or maybe legal, the communications, depending on how it is. There are a lot of decisions, and the incident management process of preparing all that in advance, like if this type of incident happens, you know exactly what's going to happen. So you're not scrambling during the incident. You kind of prepare for it in advance in peacetime is one of the aspects you mitigate, like limiting the time it takes to resolve problems.
In peace times, I like this a metaphor where if there's no incidents, we're at peace, and if there is, we're
That's
at war.
right. And the more you invest during peacetime, the less trouble you have during wartime, so to speak. I think this is the terminology the firefighters use. Like they have a pretty mature incident management process. Like we've taken a lot of what they've done there. There's a book on this by a few old-timers firefighters that took that and sort of going through the They have a practice that they actually teach organizations how to do this, and they have a book on this, like that. Some of the terminology that I took from there kind of makes sense, easy to understand.
Well, that's super interesting. Well, I want to go back to something you said about not focusing on not having incidents. So I would assume that our goal would be that we are able to reduce it so that we never actually have to run this process. But what you're saying seems to indicate that's maybe not the way.
Yeah, it's again, maybe it's not as the intuitive thing that we did find that it is not the way, both ourselves as well as the customer. So when we looked at the data, just to see the companies, the organizations that have incidents and respond to them, let's say almost daily, and this is the part, like the incident is not always a already impact, but you have some in advance, like something is going to break, or you have redundancy and one of the redundant site is gone, like your customers still work but you are exposed and so on. The companies that have incidents frequently are much more mature in their how they handle it. The ones that don't have anything, and there's an alert that something is broken about the incident, but they only get like one couple of alerts a month, they're much more like sluggish, because there is no muscle in the organization to how to respond. And because no one really knows what's going to happen, like they try to scramble, figure out like who to tell, what to put in communications to the customers and so on. Versus the ones that have things and respond and hopefully prevent, they have that muscle. Like our internal teams get quite a lot of alerts based on things that can, like daily. We kind of err on the side of caution, because it's a pretty critical service, the service we run, Ops Genie, and it needs to be very highly available because other organizations rely on it to tell them. So the team and the person that's on call during the day, they get alerts, respond to it, so they know almost muscle memory what to do, like when there is and also it reduces, we find, that stress level. Like it's not a very odd sort of a black swan type of an event. Like it happens, you know what to do. So it's like a calmer situation than like when it's a very rare kind of a thing to do. Because we find that the fear of the incident, especially for on-call people, was causing significant stress. And someone is on call, you think that they will be woken up when there's a problem, but like they have sleep problems, like all these things that even though there is no incident, there is an impact on their lives, because especially if they're not accustomed to it. So in our internal process, it takes about almost a year for an engineer to be night on call alone, like when there's a problem. So we get them, they are on call during the day for quite a while. So when there are others around, then they're not alone, they can get help quite quickly to build the confidence level. And as they do that, at some point between 6 to 12 months, they become night on call, and they're much more confident, and the stress level goes down significantly in that sense, because they have gone through that motion many times before.
That's an interesting transition to the kind of developer perspective. If I join Ops Genie and I haven't worked someplace before with the incident process, do I start an incident? What do I do if some service that I own is acting up?
Yeah, so there is maybe two different ways of working on this. One, we find, again, the more mature organizations that have higher demands on reliability and security have a lot of automation. So we have a ton of monitoring systems, external, internal, that generate alerts basically. So these automated systems, when there's a problem or there might be a problem, they generate alerts, and those alerts go to the on-call person to investigate. So at that point, there might not be an incident, like it might be preliminary. But if they think there is an incident, they initiate the process. In some cases, is there an incident, it's very clear, then you automatically start the incident process as well. So in other organizations, incidents come from users reporting something, right? Like the external, and then you start the incident process and start bringing the people in. So it's either automated through the monitoring systems, or a human initiates the incident process.
So I get an alert. It says I don't know, this database is at 99% or something.
Yeah.
And then I make a call. So what do I do if I decide it's an incident, and how do I make that call?
And that's the part, at least in our case, I think you have to give the confidence that it's okay to, like, if they believe that, pull the lever, so to speak. And the first thing they have to do is to understand the impact of the incident. Like, is it something small? Is it something big? Like one team, multi-team? So like, depending on the level of impact, there's a different incident process. And the organization, the teams typically set that up. Like if it's a priority one incident impacting customers, there is a incident process that is different than it impacts, like 1% of the users, and it's, they can do their stuff, but it's, it's a UI problem, for example. Like there is a different level. And the first thing that the on-call person does is to assess that, like, is it something that can wait till the morning? You don't, or it has to be all hands on deck. And there's a different, based on the priority they set on the incident, it would trigger a different process. And that person doesn't really have to know everything about the process. They just need to set the priority. And in our case, like the Ops Genie system would trigger a different flow. Like if it is a all hands on deck, maybe it's 3-4 different teams. You need someone from each, and it will start the notification process for each of the teams and track the process, each of them coming to a Zoom session, for example, to address it. In other, less priority, it's just one team, one person. If they can isolate what service the problem is, then you just add that team as a responder to the incident, and that team's incident process kicks in to determine like who from that team should be notified and how it should escalate and so on.
How do I actually pull the flag at Ops Genie? I'm sure it varies, but what do you do?
Yeah, you can, if you're in Slack, you can say, create incident, and that would start. There are a bunch of different ways, or there's a menu action that you create incident, and you can manually create a new incident. So it could be a fresh incident. It could be like, you can also group number of alerts and then say like, these alerts are all related to this one incident. So you can have a incident process and associate those alerts to it so that the people coming in can see that. Because it's typically not one alert. Like when something significant happens, we have a bunch of different monitoring systems. Most organizations do. They all start sending alerts, and it gets pretty noisy. Like if it's a bigger one.
You mentioned Zoom, so
yeah.
I start an incident and it starts a Zoom room, and I jump in it, and what happens? Other people join, or?
Not all incidents are handled through video conferencing. It's typically reserved to more higher priority, higher impact stuff. Like that's the incident. If you set priority 1, maybe you initiate a Zoom conference kind of a thing. If it's priority 2, it might be just chat that you handle through the chat system. The different teams do different setups there, but that's typically done in peacetime to be ready when it happens.
I think there's an incident, I start it.
Yeah.
So it starts a Slack channel. I'm not sure of like two things. First of all is who to bring in. And second of all is how to figure out what the impact is. What should I do next?
It depends on your internal systems in some ways, but our approach is that the Ops Genie kind of provides this concept of services. So each team can define the services they're providing, and other teams can create dependencies that I use this team service, so that you kind of see that in our root cause investigation. Like you asked earlier, like what is the cause of the incidents? And I mentioned the changes, and there's a flavor of it that if it's not a change that you introduced, it's typically a change that someone else introduced, that like your service depends on their service and they have a problem impacting you. So that's what you're trying to see, like you're trying to isolate the problem, like to determine the right response, like who you're going to need depending on what services are impacted. If you have put some work on it, if this service is impacted, a priority 1 incident on this service would trigger a response time that I need people from these teams, and then they would get notified into one place. And at that point, you are investigating. Like we do provide tools like for different services incidents. You can run actions to trigger like the most common things that you want to. It's a website, is it still up, right? Like you can check that. It's maybe the DNS resolution to see, like, or you run a trace route to see like how the network stuff is. You can put those into the incident. And typically the organizations that are more mature have runbooks basically, because you want even the junior people to be able to go through the first steps to understand like where it is. Runbooks typically have the actions like do this first, do that next, kind of things, and they start from who to bring in. If the system doesn't support it, that will be manually in the runbook. Progressively, they go into more investigative steps, like okay, run this command, check whether this is working, or like the typical things to do. But I think those steps are very useful in identifying the right course of action in terms of what should the response should be. The conflict is often because there's like lots of these things happen. So you want to wake everybody up, so to speak, if it is a real problem, but you don't want to wake everybody up if it isn't a problem. So you get that sort of a tugging in both directions, and that type of a setup, this is the runbook, this is how you decide, it reduces again the pressure on the people who are responding, initial like first responders, so to speak, to the incident, to call. Like you don't want to blame them for doing that if they need to pull it, and that's where like the more context you give to them and empower them to identify, because if they don't have that information, it's they become sort of a don't have the tools to make the decision, and no matter what they do, like there's an implication to it. Like you don't want them to hesitate to call people because they're afraid of what people will say and so on.
Yeah, it seems like a hard balance to find, I guess.
Yeah, it is harder for the junior ones as well.
yeah, because they don't want to wake everybody up.
Yeah.
So I see that the database is really high usage. So I start an incident, I go to the runbook. The runbook says, check, okay, 3 services use this. Are they up? And it's like, oh yeah, they're up. And maybe then the usage starts to fall down. So what do I do? Is that the end for that particular incident? Like maybe the impact is minor, or?
If the impact is minor, typically, again, depending on when it is, that like if it's work hours, you may solve that. Each team handles differently. Like I think one of the things that is impactful is that there are low frequency, high impact incidents. Like when those happen, they don't happen very often, but when it happens, it makes the news, so to speak. If it is a big company, and there's lots of high frequency, low impact ones. All that spectrum is really necessary to have peaceful development time. The developers are impacted by one of the things that we've just done, like showing we call the unplanned work. Like anytime you're working on incidents, you're doing unplanned work, and it impacts your planned work, which Atlassian has Jira, as you may know.
Yeah.
And when you're planning the next sprint or something like that, if you don't know the level of unplanned work, it's often the cause of friction, and it also messes up with your planning, because you think it's this many hours. So we try to combine the unplanned work, like how much time the team collectively spent in the last sprint, so that you can kind of try to gauge, is it going up or down? Is your unplanned time percentage-wise overall, is it going up?
So at Ops Genie, what level of unplanned would you feel is a problem?
I would say 20% is pretty high. If you continuously have that, we try to reduce that quite lower than that. I think we are somewhat fortunate in the sense that it's pretty clear that this service needs to be reliable. So we don't have to justify it, right? If it's not reliable, business is no longer there. I find it is harder for some of my colleagues, friends, do I build a new feature or invest more into, cleaning up the code to reduce technical debt and so on. It's not always easy. So that's what we're trying to help with, in the product, to show how much time you're spending, because it's often intuitive. I'm spending too much time, but you can't quantify the impact of that. If you can invest and reduce the unplanned time, few percentage points, it opens up additional capacity later that you can invest in development. And the worst, I think, when people see the unplanned time is kind of creeping up, like it's on the way up versus down. It's more of a like which way it's going. Like if it's going, at least you can see the light at the end of the tunnel. If it's going down, if it's going up, like you're gonna be in bigger trouble. So it's more than the number. It's probably the trend of like which direction it's heading is more important, probably for most teams. It sort of damages the morale as well, and so like becomes a vicious circle. Like it really is key to like nip it on early on and make sure that it doesn't creep up. So just being aware of that, like how much unplanned time you have spent every cycle, I think is super useful for teams to not to get into that like vicious cycle, so to speak.
Got it. So you said that there are certain sort of high frequency, low impact incidents that may be happening. Could you give some examples of getting people's attention?
Yeah, the cloud infrastructure is designed to fail, right? Like that was the biggest thing. Like we used to design all these like super resilient stuff and like assume that they will never fail, or at least tried that, versus like, you're running AWS cloud, like stuff fails all the time. So you get 500s, or the queue starts building up because there's some kind of problem somewhere and it starts routing around that. So every time, an SQS queue, for example, builds up is an alert. Sometimes it resolves because additional resources are automatically provisioned. Sometimes it doesn't. So there are some automated ways or manual ways to handle the problems. Like maybe one of the servers went down and you got some bunch of 500, but they got retried, and going through that. One school of thought is like, you don't have to worry about those till there is a customer impact. Mm-hmm. I find that if you can get away with it, that's the easier approach, right? Like if you don't have to react to problems until there is a customer impact, which your business requirements might allow that is a lower burden on the developers and operations people. We can't afford that. Like if we had multiple outages within the same year, that you would see the financial impact of it directly in our business. So like we do a lot more alerting early on before that the impact, like this queue is climbing up, or the number of retries go up, like what is going on? Is that something that's going to fail if we don't address? Or so like each of those generate an alert and someone responds to it to monitor what's happening, to prevent an outage, prevent a customer impacting incident. So there's quite a bit of those, but the muscle to like figure out what might be causing that is something that only happens with it. Like that's why we call like 6 to 12 months, depending on the seniority of the developers, to get that, because they know if this queue is building up, it's typically something there, right? Like, we're sending text messages and the Twilio interface is acting up. Like that's what's causing this. Those type of things, you can write them down, but like you're not going to be able to read them like when there's an incident. So it's it has to be like a muscle memory almost to in some ways. And if you get there, even if it's middle of the night, you look at some of the alerts and assess, this is a big problem, priority one incident, go, or you can snooze it till the morning, and then in the morning it would notify you again, hey, like there was an incident and so on. If it's still active, you can take a look at that, or whoever is on call at that time can take a look into it. So it's a assessment, and the right level of response is really what they need to figure out, and experience is the only way to gain that.
It's interesting. I think that I heard you say something like, so we have this queue, and if the work backs up, we want to spin up more nodes, and maybe we could automate that. But if we automate away all of our minor incidents, then nobody knows how to run an incident. So you actually...
Yeah, that is that's exactly what we see, which is interesting. So like the automation in two ways, like one, people don't have the experience, and the two, the automation has problems too. Like, so that the more complex that automations get, the most problematic instance that I had seen, there was some kind of automation that went haywire, like the more so than the actual problems. Like, so it's
What's an example of automation going awry?
one of the things was like the retiring, like ramping down after build up, like you added nodes and capacity. And when it was doing that, it messed things up. So there was no instance left that was accessible. So the process to ramp, I mean, right now it's like AWS has far more stable systems for auto scaling. Early on, we had our own mechanisms. So it would scale up. Scale up was tested much more than the scale down. So during the scale down, the logic got messed up, and it took the systems out of the balancer, and they were no longer. It looked like they were there, but they weren't serving traffic. So we had a sort of a semi outage there. Like it was the one instance left had to handle all the load. So this is code as well, and it's a very hard to test code if you're writing automation. All the edge cases is hard to test. So that's why when a cloud provider like AWS has those things, they generally gone through a lot of, lots of customers use it, all the edge cases and stuff. When you do your own automation, I think there's a higher degree of risk in there because it's hard to find all the edge cases and test them. Like it's not necessarily software. Like they have to fail in certain ways. The chaos engineering discipline is trying to sort of address that. Like there is a growing in the last few years discipline around chaos engineering that essentially you introduce failures into the system regularly to make sure that the system handles that. So if you have failover, multiple regions, all those type of things, what if happens if I remove one server, 5 servers, whole data center, like availability zone? If you're doing those, again, it builds muscle to do that. And I've seen customers even do sort of packet level ones. One of my companies I'm involved with have software that introduces, the delay, if this service gets overwhelmed and it starts slowing and slower, what is the impact of that on the other services? So it introduces a delay on the response of that, and then you kind of observe what is happening, right? Like with the microservices, the interdependency is increasing a lot. So you're testing all this in production really is the only way to do it because you have the actual loads and actual data in there to be able to see it. So we are evolving, but I think the complexity of the systems and the speed of change, like it's going faster than we can adapt our processes and the disciplines. Like all this stuff is fairly new to tackle all this complexity. Like how do we deal with this? How do we, because microsystems essentially, or microservices, the complexity is moving to the production. It's all in the production, like as opposed to in the code, like where you have debuggers and like we have tools in a complex application when it's a monolith, but when it's all in pieces, it is a distributed monolith in some ways, and there's like all these unexpected interactions between the systems that you can only tease out by interjecting some of the failures. So I think that will grow in time as, again, maturity level, right? Like the organizations typically start from like when something happens, I want to make sure that someone is aware. Like that's the first step. Yeah, that's where Ops Genie started. Like that was the 7 years ago. How do we ensure that I can sleep and I know that the system is going to wake me up? But then, like, okay, you wake up and you don't know anything about the system, you're not going to be able to do much. So providing context around the incident are similar ones, like from the past, taking a look. Collaboration, like finding the right person, it grows in time. But most organizations are still fairly new to this. The incident stuff, management process. If a typical organization would tell you when you say incident management, like what do you think of? They would think of the ITSM type incidents, which is really the user reporting it. Like a user calls in like, hey, I can't get to the finance application or it doesn't work, whatever. And you open up a ticket, you escalate to somebody, and like they eventually take a look at it. The urgency level is very different than like I can't afford downtime. I must instrument my application and monitor from outside so that like when there's a problem, I get that to the right person, which is typically you want to get to the developer responsible for that part of the application because they are the best equipped to assess the problem and solve the problem as opposed to a generic ops person that, you have hundreds of applications in an enterprise.
So I think that in itself is a change as well.
Yeah.
That the developer is the person to talk to. Have you found that to be a hard cultural change for people to make?
Yeah, it is. It is very hard. I think this part of the cultural change that the DevOps movement tries to make it easier, like how to make that change. But it is very difficult. The idea in this case is that whoever is building it, you build it, you'll run it, like whatever, there are a number of different ways to address it. But is the person the best equipped to solve the problem? And because you want to minimize the time to restore, you want to find the best person as quickly as possible. So the developer becomes much more critical in the process. Like in most organizations today, traditionally, the incident management is organized to minimize the amount of work done by higher skilled people. It's not organized around time. It's more like, so you have a first level support, may create a ticket. If they can't solve it, second level, third level. So you have, high cost, high quality that people that you can use elsewhere. So you don't want them to just do incidents. So you try to protect them.
Yeah.
And that paradigm completely changed. Now you say like it's optimized around time. Like I want to go straight to the person that knows the best so that they can solve it as fast as possible. That is very difficult change because rightly it puts a lot more demand on the developers and not every developer is, there's different lifestyles that being on call is not a easy thing, that especially if it's not done right. If you're on call 1 week out of 3 weeks or 4 weeks or something like that, which we've seen, that's a lot. And especially if the system is not stable and you get notified, you get alerts at night, it is a problem. So there's all kinds of things you can do to reduce that, but there's going to be some extra burden. So I've seen all kinds of pushback and the change, but there is some options, but not really that many. Like the geographical distribution helps. Like if you have teams in Europe and Asia and US, you minimize the off-hour time, so the teams can pass on. Atlassian is fortunate in that sense. We have teams in California and Australia, as well as we are in Turkey, so you can kind of pass on the baton for who's gonna take on the incident, which it helps. But even with that, not every team has members in different locations. So within your team, you might have to be on call, and if you're on call, you can't leave home, or you have to walk around with your computer or whatever it is. It's not a, if you haven't, if you're going to a job knowing that's the requirement is different than your company is going through a transformation, is now you're expected to do all this. I find the organizations have a lot more trouble doing that transition to the existing culture, right? Because it is different. Before you would do it and you pass it on, you go home, versus you're now responsible for the operation of that. Having said that, I also find that there is nothing like being the one on call when there is something going wrong to motivate you that you better do a good job. It's basically that responsibility and awareness doesn't come naturally if you're not the one. And I always push the managers to be on call as well. I don't care that you can't fix anything. You have to be woken up and be present to appreciate when we're talking about the priority of the investing in reliability versus features. To make the right decision, you really need everyone to share the pain, so to speak.
Once I've seen something explode, then when they're saying we should build this new feature, I'll be thinking, well, wait, I don't want to be paged again.
Sadly, yes. Sadly, like if you're not the one waking up, it doesn't make the same impact. Like it's like, I mean, we lived through this internally. Like it's like you really appreciate why it is important. Like the Ops Genie team has this concept. It's not special to us. This definition of done. That like after you write the code, then you run the tests, and a peer reviewer would ask a bunch of questions like, what about this, did you think of this, and stuff like this, so that you get to definition like the done by yes, like we've looked at all that, because the cost of not doing that is someone waking up at nighttime, or on call being much more painful, and you appreciate more as a developer. It's just if you are the one experiencing in the first hand. That's like,
Yeah.
if you don't pay attention to quality, you're going to get impacted. The friction typically is with the management, like making decisions on like where to put the time. So that's why like one of the techniques is to like you have to have a incident manager, and one of the managers have to wake up like when this happens, even if all they're doing is taking notes. It's fine, and that helps with the empathy, I think, to decide like where we put our time and effort next.
That's a battle-hardened cultural tip. Make the managers on call. Yeah.
Yes.
So if I'm a developer, I join Ops Genie or wherever, like, so what's the expectations? How often am I on call? What are the expectations when I'm on call?
We settle with a system that works really well, I think, and you are, after the first couple months, you are on call from in your team during the day. We have a concept of day on call. So you within a month or two, you are day on call, which means that you're getting alerts. You have to figure out what's happening and then address the problem. But that's sort of trains you in the sense, and in that sense, you only need to know your team's, like whatever the services that your team owns, like that domain. In time, you're expected to learn other domains, because our night on calls are expected to, like, we don't have a night on call for each team. The night on call is responsible for the entire system, which means they need to understand enough to isolate where the problem is and bring the right team from that. And that's a higher degree of sophistication that the person needs. And that's typically why it takes at least 6 months to get there, often 9 months or up to a year. And the reason with that is we have, I think, in our team, like about 15 people who are night on call qualified, which means that you are not on call very frequently. Like it gets in, once in 3-4 months, 1 week out of 3-4 months, lower. If you can't do that, then it's like often more on call. We find the problems with that. If you're on call like a week out of a month, or like too frequently, it is harder to do. So we opted up with this system that it takes time to get the person there, but when they're there, they're on call at nighttime, but not very frequently, because they know the entire system, and we share the on call. So we have like two different, we have an SRE on call and a sort of an application, a product on call person, as opposed to each of the 11 teams that we have having on call. And that someone being able to address multiple domains made it less frequent. And this like compounds to many different things. Like for this to work, you really need to have low turnover. So we have low turnover, so we can kind of optimize for that. Like we don't want people to, like if you're getting developers in and out, like this model wouldn't work. So it encourages you as the organization to invest more into the keeping the developers longer, and making sure they have the right tools and so on. So it can change the entire dynamics of the organization to be able to handle like the on-call in an organization has implications beyond what you might initially think, like how everything from compensation to how you organize the teams and so on gets impacted by this when you have always on 24/7 critical services to support.
Interesting. If I'm on call, I'm the night on call, something happens and I track it down to some service changed and something else didn't change.
Yeah.
Should I be, opening up my IDE and trying to make extensive changes to address things?
No, I mean, if it's in that level, you probably first need help. Like you shouldn't be doing it yourself. But we typically go for the restoration of the service as opposed to fixing the problem. So it's often can it be rolled back if it is something to it, like if it's a recent change, and that's typically a much lower risk kind of a thing than fix. We almost never fix it at that time unless there is no other way to do it. That's why you want to make a change during the day and observe like everything is working if it's something new. The hardest ones to handle are when you're making a change that is not reversible, like you're changing the schema, data structure, so you can't just roll back the code.
Mm-hmm.
Those are hard, so you don't want them to break at nighttime. Like if that happens, I think it is quite hard to handle. But often roll back to a previous stuff is fairly straightforward. We have Slack commands for all those, like how to do those things. They can typically run few commands and restore the service, and then later on we can look into what went wrong. So it's often like restoration of the service takes precedence over fixing what the problem is. That's asking too much, I think. Like under pressure coding it's for movies. I think we don't want people to do.
So the cheat sheet for being on call is make sure your manager's on call as well, and then just always hit rollback. That
sounds about right. Yeah, I think I basically say like whoever makes decisions, you want them to feel what is it like in a high pressure incident when you have thousands of customers impacted. It messes up the person. So like you don't want anyone individually shoulder that. You want people to as well as like not just the managers but the peers. And so Ops Genie team has always been very, very good at that. Like when there's something, you typically you push a button and there are 4 or 5 people, whether they're on call or not, jumping in if it is serious to prevent the outage. It really depends on the expectation on the service. Like it's all about business requirement. Like if you can live with it till the morning, don't, obviously. But we have increasingly more and more services like ours that customers have that cannot afford downtime. So organizations are trying to adapt to how to operate without burning people. One of the organizations I worked in the past they had an operator that was responsible for getting to the right person as opposed to our software doing it. And he said basically so what do you call? I go, I look and then I call, and we looked at the records and he was calling John. There were 4 people in the team, and 70% of the time it was John that was called. Well, why is this? Well, John didn't yell at the guy for calling them at night. So he was the nice guy. So they just kept calling John. The other guys were, cranky, at nighttime, whatever. So, and especially if it was a false alarm, they were not happy. So they gravitated toward this one person, right? So it's not fair that, John was a nice guy. So he didn't yell at them. So he got called a lot more than the other people. So there's a lot of unwritten procedures and stuff that builds around this because of this high stress nature of that. Some of the managing with a software in an equitable way takes that, after using the software, it says, I want to notify the database team. They don't decide who in the database team. The database team decides who that night and how it escalates. And so it takes off the pressure on the person who needs to raise the bell, so to speak, to notify people. So it helps quite a lot, yeah.
So it makes sense to have all this planned out in peacetime, as you call it, to figure out who gets called during what times.
Yep.
So what do you do after the incident? How do you learn from this?
Yeah, so postmortems, as it's commonly called, or better name maybe post-incident review or analysis, is we're trying to move to those less morbid names on that. That process.
But you're already using the wartime, peacetime metaphor.
That's right.
So
Yeah, the terminology is quite dramatic in this area. Like every incident is really a huge opportunity to learn. If you have the right culture, which is, like this, you may hear like blameless postmortems. So instead of, focusing on whose fault it was, to identify the systematic issues, like what caused it. Like even if it was someone pushed this button, like why did they push that button? Like it's often easier to push the blame onto a person than tackle the systematic issues. So the postmortem is like, there are different ways. I've seen companies, 5 whys is a method used in Atlassian, like to keep asking questions to where it is. Our software also tries to facilitate this. You can generate something that's takes all the information that happens during the incident, like when the alert came, like when was the conference started, who was in the conference, how long they spent as time in there. So like you can kind of get a sense, and all the like different milestones that people enter during the incident becomes a record in the post incident review. But then, obviously people still need to talk about like why that happened and so on. So in our world, in the Atlassian world, Ops Genie would generate a report and publish into Confluence. Then the rest of the work can be done with comments there, people adding stuff. And there might be issues to, like, as you were saying, like, instead of fixing that, like after the incident, there are changes to be made, and the Jira issues will be created that linked from the post-incident review to the Jira issues, so that incident managers can trace that, make sure that they are resolved in a timely manner. So in mature organizations, this process, post-incident review, is a significant process. Like it's a whole workflow that needs to happen with people, different teams participating in it. There is a good quote from Allspa that one of the people who are, sort of leaders in this space, about like one of the ways you can track the maturity is judging from how many non-technical people attend the post-incident reviews, or like attend or participate, right? So like if the managers or the sales, whatever, like just not the engineers, but the other people, the more they get involved, like it's a signal that the organization is actually learning from that and the participating, which I find in personal experience true as well. It's typically, if it just stays technical, it's easy to, like, it's this technology is buggy and that's why it happens. Like it, you can pigeonhole and move on. It's often learnings are diminished in that type of attitude. So it's like you try to make it more as open as possible is one of the best practices, I think, like and comprehensive to learn from that. It's an opportunity that should not be missed to mitigate from the risk of happening again.
What comes out of this incident review process? Like, if I've done this well, what's the value? So
it's typically, there's a report, there's a follow-up actions that if it is a bug, it's obvious that you would have a follow-up action to fix the bug, but there are also actions that, typically addresses the resiliency. Like this happened, it will look at why did it take us half an hour to identify the problem, right? Like how do we reduce that? Why did it take 20 minutes to gather the right people? Like the process improvements. So those are the follow-up actions that the report and the actions that comes through, that gets widely, I think, disseminated in the mature organizations. I read quite a bit the post-incident analysis reports that teams that come up with. Again, you would learn quite a bit, like from what other teams are doing as well, because you can find single point of failures there. You can find process inefficiencies. If there are people, burnout or you can find those things, identify, and I think there are a bunch of actions to address those things, the underlying structural issues to prevent. Often in our world, again, this is different. In the past, the same incidents would happen repeatedly.
Okay.
So you can have this first level, second level, third level. The first level support will, this is the same incident, and now I know what to do, and I fix that.
Yeah.
In our world, the same incident almost never happens twice, because something happens and then you go fix the bug. The next one will be different. What will be the same is the structural issues that's causing the response time, how long it takes to identify the problem. Those things are, stay the same. So if you focus on those, like the process issues, people are empowered, all those things that impact, that's when you start making, I think, gains against how long it takes to solve or even prevent the incidents from happening is really that process, that as opposed to like this bug in this application. That bug is fixed, it's not going to happen again, but there's going to be something else that will happen.
And I take it if the same incident is happening again, I don't know, you're probably not taking the right actions or something.
Yeah, if the same thing is happening again, that's a much bigger problem. Like that means that you're not addressing the underlying issue for whatever the reason. And sometimes it's you can't replace the technology that easily, so it keeps causing problems. But it tells you, if you we have a lot of reporting tools to analyze the past incidents alerts to unearth some of those as well. Like, look, we are getting a bunch of things from this technology, like whether it's an application or some kind of database or external service you use, whatever it is. If you can gain the insights that's causing, you can prioritize whether you want to replace or invest more into stabilizing it. That's kind of a part of the post-incident. Like these are, again, like stuff that you do in the peacetime, like analyze your data for insights, like what's causing it, what is the response time of different teams. Like these are all questions you can ask the data we collect in Ops Genie to optimize the process basically and learn like why things are happening. If same people are getting notified, like their on-call system, they might be underpowered or like they don't have enough senior people that can take the burden. Like those are, developers are hard to recruit and you want to retain them. Like if you're causing burnout, like you're hurting yourself. So like any kind of early signs of those that you can detect, because people sustain that kind of punishment for a while, but then they just quit, right? Like, so you can't wait till they complain about it. Not every developer complains loudly. It's important for the management to pay attention to how the sort of a developer's health in that sense, that are the processes sustainable in that sense that, you're not burdening people.
What do you think the biggest mistake is that organizations make as they're making this transition to have a process?
I think the biggest mistake is the underestimating the cultural aspects of it. We have quite a bit of a tendency to lean on tools as a solution to this. The cultural change is, often in almost every part of the business harder. You're expecting quite a bit. I think we are expecting quite a bit of a change in people, especially if you do those without involving them into the thought process, like why this is happening, how it's going to make better, and it happens to them. I've seen the biggest problems in the organizations that someone decides to adopt DevOps, and then like pushes the organization. You're all DevOps now, and you're on call, whatever. There's huge problems with that, as opposed to the team sort of reaching to that conclusion, or at least even if it is not fun to do, like they appreciate that it needs to be done. That consensus, like building that, like the fact that it increased productivity in the sense that you have less unplanned, like the stuff that we talked about in the beginning. It's unintuitive, but it reduces the unplanned work. Like all that, not building the consensus in the organization and involving the change necessary, it gets underestimated, and then it kind of blows up later. That's the biggest problem that I've seen.
Yeah, there's definitely some unintuitive aspects of it. I was wondering, it seems like incident management process, you talked about firefighters. Like traditionally, this has kind of been the domain of emergency services.
Yeah.
So why is this becoming important in the world of software?
Yeah, I think it's part of the software is eating the world, concept, right? Like it's just our dependency, reliance on software is increasing in a very rapid pace.
That makes a lot of sense. software is becoming much more important, and there's lots of places we can learn from. So I know that Atlassian put together an incident management handbook that probably goes into a lot more details. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. Berkay, thanks so much. This has been great talking to you. This is Adam Gordon Bell, and thank you for listening to Software Engineering Radio.
Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To provide feedback, you can comment on each episode on the website or reach us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or through our Slack channel at seradio.slack.com. You can also email us at team@se-radio.net. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under Creative Commons License 2.5. Thanks for listening.